So it is often the case, although current research, as we have heard, is refreshingly changing this practice, that the history of medieval paper is told from the main places of its European production rather than its use. Indeed, Briquet famously explained that the premises of his investigation follow this rationale. And regarding England, he famously says, "Nous avons également la fait d'écouter l'Angleterre parce que l'industrie papetière se n'y est pas développée de bonne heure." In my book, Paper in Medieval England, From Pulp to Fictions, I have already explained how peripheries of paper production can in fact become centers of paper use with a wealth of evidence still untapped. But more importantly, we need to move away from the notion that paper in medieval England was little used until the 15th century. The evidence that I have discovered in my journey into medieval paper in British archives unfolded a far richer narrative of transnational interaction and movement of paper and people. So in what follows, I would like to talk a little about the early evidence of paper that I discovered, and then think a little bit more about paper stocks. It is known, as we heard from Alessandra, that no paper making mill existed in England until the end of the 15th century. And even after that, paper was an imported commodity. This is usually where the history of paper in England starts. These are two early registers, which are dated to 1307. And this is for the Lynn register, and the other register is 1309, so the very beginning of the 14th century. My question, however, is how did the people of Lynn and Lyme Regis get to know paper? What was known about paper before then? And indeed, if one searches the archives a little bit more, then the age of paper in England really starts in the 13th century. So it is difficult to know exactly how paper got to England, but there is something that we know quite well. What we know is, for example, that Italian merchants during the 13th century arrived in England to profit from the wool business, serving the English court and also the Pope. They were also the merchants, the banker for the Pope, that came over to collect taxes. So there were fairly few Italians around in 13th century England. And as I was looking through the archive, I came across this enrollment of this document. In this case, we're talking about the Riccardi, the family of the Riccardi. At that moment in time, they were going through a spot of trouble with the court. They were about to get bankrupted, and all their accounts needed to be checked and brought into the exchequer. So in this case, we have on the 18th of September, 1295, Henry of Courton inscribed on behalf of William of March, who was the king's treasurer, the following note on the memoranda roll of the exchequer. Liberavit ed idem scaccarium unum librum papiri ligatum et uno quaternum papiri in una pucia sigillata. Que sum mercatorum de societate Ricardorum de Lucca. The important thing here is the emphasis on the paper, on the book of paper, and on this paper quire into a shell pouch made of paper. The document audited the wool transaction of the company of the Riccardi and declared not only registered that the accounts were delivered to the exchequer, but he also wanted to know the fact that they were made on paper. This is, to my knowledge, the first known evidence, witness evidence of paper use in England in the 13th century. Of course, evidence such as this don't come across often, but what we, however, know is that paper in the 13th century circulated extensively in letter form, and those letters also arrived in England. So I'm just putting here on this slide just a few examples of the letter arriving from Europe into England. We do know that the epistolary culture between the 12th and the 13th century was growing and developing through a variety of official and personal interaction. And, you know, it's also always useful to remind what Petrucci told us, l'Europa reimpara a scriversi in that period. And here is one of these examples. The majority of the letters in this table show interaction from foreign chancery and nobility with Henry III. I don't have time to go through all of them, but it's really quite a fascinating world of connection in the English court. This, of course, was only the beginning of what I tried to find out. As we then move into the 14th century, we have a real wealth of information and paper changes. But I just want to show you before I move on. This is an example of one of these letters that I told you, and the type of paper. Of course, this is not watermark paper, although I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's really another fascinating part of the history of contact of paper in England. As we move through the century, so we then end up in the 14th century, the history of paper becomes a little bit more exciting, because not only we have the paper in those registers that I show you, but it also starts using in all sorts of other forms and examples. So these are a couple of other examples where paper is used. On your left, you have that long roll that is an account of the medicine of Edward II, so the very beginning of the 13th century, and probably made by his apothecary, Bartholomew May, who not only was an apothecary, but he also sold quite a lot of paper in England during that period. Then you can see a little receipt of passage with probably carts going in and out of London. And then at the top there, you see a scrunched up receipts coming from the Exchequer. We're talking here about 1350s probably. And what is fascinating in those receipts is that the court was really, or the Exchequer wanted to buy lots of paper and parchment, but the paper, not just any paper, but royal paper in particular, that seems to be enamored with royal paper. So again, these are just some of the early examples that I've been compiling into a database. Now I would like to move a little bit more into my work on what I'm also trying to do, thinking about quantifying paper in England. That I've been compiling over the year. The paper manuscript and document of this sorry, I'll just move on to another example, which I forgot to show you on the slides. Here, I just want to show this because that watermark there, which is an early example of paper 1339, is a weight or un peso, and you can find some of those examples of watermarks actually in the new launched Zongi archive that we just being heard about this morning. So really, we're really trying to then connect even more example and trying to work out how then the papers that we have in English archives also appear and where they come from. So going back to this database that contains all of this documentation. In this database that I've been collecting, I've collected pretty much about 6,000 documents. 800 of those are on paper, and there is quite a lot that we need to check. What, however, became apparent as I was looking for paper in medieval England, it also became apparent a lot of the documents in the book that I discovered were not dated properly. And again, and this is the second part of my project that was mentioned at the beginning of the paper, the time and space. My ambition to try to think a little bit more carefully about the chronology of the paper in British archives, and also to think a little bit more about this idea of time lag. This idea that paper seems to be circulated for 20, 30 years, and therefore we cannot date manuscripts which are, for example, in England, more accurately. But why do we do that? Why is that there is this need to redate and to reconsider the chronology of paper in England? Well, because much of what we know so far about watermarks has been done by all these early colleagues. So here I put some examples. The very early attempt to publish a watermark or to try to think about the use of watermark for dating books in England started with a fen. And here you have the publication. Those were the earliest watermarks that he found in the Paston's letters, so 15th century letters. And then, of course, one of the most famous, and I think this is has been used extensively by scholars, is the famous work by Heywood, Sources of English of Early English Paper Supply. Of course, it was Heywood who argued that the early source of paper in England was of Italian origin, at least until the beginning of the 15th century. And then French paper started to be used and became more influential on the British market after that period. But in my search, and really trying to work out this idea of chronology and how we can move forward with the chronology of paper, I've also discovered that there are other unpublished material on early watermarks in English archives. As I examine, it's working. As I examined the manuscripts in Cambridge University Library, I came across this album. This is in the additional collection, and it is a remarkable collection of tracing which belonged to W.Y. Otley and was compiled around 1830. William Young Otley died in 1838. And following the fervent 17th and 19th century interest in the iconography of watermark paper, he collected tracing from 14th and 15th century paper, principally from manuscript and printed book written in The Hague. So there's a section on The Hague, but also another section which was compiled using the National Archives, material from the National Archives, the British Library, the Tower of London, and the British Museum. So Otley attempted what Briquet did later, but he also, in his, what's very interesting is that in a much earlier attempt, he also identified twins. There is quite a lot of interesting work that he's done on the chronology of paper that perhaps we can learn something from. And I'm hoping to make available more of this information in a forthcoming project in collaboration with Ed Potton. But despite this early interest in watermarks and the availability of this tracing, what we still don't have is a systematic census of paper stocks in British archives. And yet such census would be invaluable on a number of fronts. The reason why we still need this census is we don't have a sense of scale. We don't know how much paper was well, we do know that lots of paper was imported in Britain in large quantities. We heard from Di Stefano this morning as well, some example there. But what we don't know is correlation between this importation and use, but also how much do we have? Of course, value, so the significance of paper in time and space is still a bit of a question mark. And finally, significance, and I think sometimes this is even, I wouldn't say more important, but everything is the sum of all its parts, which is, can we understand network of knowledge through paper stocks? The paper is at the center, everything else goes around it. What is it telling us about the whole idea? So regarding the first point, and still looking at the material in archives that we have in England, we also have some of the earliest example of paper of watermark paper. So this is one of the Riccardi letters that I mentioned before, that you saw before in the slides. Unfortunately, I couldn't take the picture as I wanted it because it's in the special care of the National Archives. They don't allow us to go in with special images, etc. But you can actually see there from that on this image, you can actually see two signs. One is a B or a P, and one is a G. So this is a letter that was actually dated 1298. This is not a letter that talks to us about the use of paper in England, because this letter was sent from Lucca to the Riccardi in London. But it tells us something about paper sent from Italy with watermark very early, which I don't think has yet been recorded. So again, looking into the archives abroad might give us a sense of our own early history of paper making in Italy. We've seen this morning that Zonghi thought that this sort of watermark were used more at the beginning of the 14th century. This letter is at the end. So again, can we look into the archives to connect more dots and tell us more about the paper history? Regarding the question of value and scale, I would like just to mention a couple of examples from the paper manuscript in the Cambridge University Library collection. Cambridge University Library holds about 110 manuscripts on paper, dated to the late medieval period and copied in England. So the library has got more, but I'm just talking about the one copied in England. If we focus on the paper stocks and the class of watermarks, no, why? Stop there. If we focus on the paper stock and the classes of watermark, then we have about 57 groups. And the identification of the full paper stock, I have to say, is still in progress, because lots of books are folded in quarto, octavo, etc. So I don't really have a specific number of paper stock. But what I can tell is that a manual count gives me an estimate of about 200 paper stock, which are present in this corpus, and possibly more. Don't quote me on this yet. It's all preliminary work. And I hope to get to the end of all this quantification very soon. These results came to me as a surprise because there is often the perception that we have an infinite number of watermarks. But in fact, when we actually think about the paper stock, everything seems to become more manageable, and also we seem to see that certain paper stock come in, stop using, and move on. And this is an experiment that probably doesn't make much sense, but you can really see how then all the manuscripts can be grouped, the paper stock can be grouped together. And again, experiment doesn't mean it's final results, but this is something that I really would like to work on a little bit more. And just to focus on my final example, all of these three books contain the same paper stock. This is a paper stock which is very rare. It's a dog paper stock written on royal paper. Out of 800 paper books, it appears only in these three books in the university library. If we zoom into the actual watermark here, what you can tell, I hope you can tell that it is the same watermark. It's a dog watermark. Measuring on a paper measuring 58 centimeter by 40 centimeter before folding, so the full sheet, It contains 15 chain lines per unfolded sheet and include one tranche de fil on which the watermark is attached. What is really interesting, and this is where I would like to pose a question rather than offer a solution. This watermark is usually associated to other paper that we know. So it is included in our album. So it's also compared to Zonghi 9885 on the Briquet archive, and it's usually dated around the beginning of the 15th century, 1416. This is the example, and the Corpus Cartarum di Fabriano was really an excellent opportunity to get it compared. And the truth, however, is that this is not the same paper. So the watermark is very similar, measure very similar, but the paper is chancery, the one we have in the repertoire, whereas the paper in the manuscript that I was looking at is royal. Hence my question, is it possible, if we think a little bit more about molds, that paper maker had different size of molds with very similar watermark? You know, earlier we heard we want to know more about mold, and I think this is one question that we need to think. What does it mean, different shape of paper within the production of paper itself? Again, this is a question I don't have an answer, and this is really my concluding example of some of the cracks, some of the issues I want to think of. I have another example with French paper, but I'll leave it to that. So as work on this project continues, and I attempt to bring to completion this thinking on how to go about talking and thinking about paper in time and space in medieval England, I remain convinced that we should start to build a reference library on paper stocks rather than watermarks to provide tangible material context to our identification of the watermarks themselves. Once paper stocks have been mapped out, it will be possible to think through the material relationship, including tracing and localization. Quantities will enable to identify pattern and offer a distant microanalysis linked to our perception and understanding of data collected. After all, paper has been dubbed one of the most important events in European intellectual history, and trying to quantify that importance, I think, is still valuable. Thank you very much.